Great. Well, I'd like to welcome everybody to the fourth and final event of our Count Women In series. And for those of you who don't know me, my name is Jillian Hines. And as president of Ask Her YYC, I'm really excited to introduce tonight's event, Women Belong in the House and the Council Chambers. Before I get into what the event is, I just have a couple of things I want to make sure I share with the group tonight. Sorry, and I've got the baby here as well. But I want to start first with our land acknowledgement. And so at Ask Her, we really endeavor to honor the land and its treaties and to strengthen our relationship with them. And so I'd like to acknowledge that we're here tonight on the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Tsuut'ina, the Nakota Nations, the Métis Nations, and all people who make their home in Treaty 7. We thank you for hosting us on the land tonight. And it's been an incredibly busy year and actually a busy fall for Ask Her. And if you were here at our September Count Women In event, I think I said it was busy. And in 4 or 5 weeks since then, it's even more busy. We're actually continuing our second cohort of the Prepare Her program. And we launched our second Mentor Her program, which will include 6 mentoring sessions over the next 8 weeks. And by the end of 2020, we're expecting to see over 60 women complete our different programs, and really can't wait to see what amazing things these folks will sort of take the world and the political world by storm. And I think even more exciting, we've actually seen 2 of our Prepare Her cohort officially announce that they're running in Calgary City Council. And so we've got some change happening, and we're just so thrilled to be part of that. I also want to acknowledge before we get into our panel that we've gotten some feedback around the lack of diverse representation that we've had at some of our events. And I want to acknowledge that, and I want to sit with that for a minute. For Ask Her, it's not okay. We are striving to have all sorts of representation and visible diverse representation in particular. And I do want to clarify for tonight, we did reach out to a variety of diverse folks from different backgrounds, from different races, ethnicities, and we weren't able to actually secure that diversity for this evening. And again, it's visible diversity that we're missing tonight, and we're going to do better. And so that's something that we're actively trying to address to make sure we have the different representation that we want to see in our political councils and that our community represents. And so just, I thank everyone for that feedback. We acknowledge it. And I would ask this fantastic community, if you do know of any folks that are interested in being part of our panels as community leaders, as political leaders, as activists, whatever it may be, please let us know and we will follow up directly. And so thank you for that. And now I do want to say the countdown to 2021 is real. We are actually 1 year away from the next municipal election. And over the past year, our Count Women In series has hosted some incredible women who have shared their challenges, their joys, their wealth of knowledge regarding their lived experiences in the political world. And we're here tonight for one last conversation this year about politics, parenting, and many other roles that shape that shape the public expectations of women and those expectations that we actually have for ourselves. And we have just an amazing group of experts and facilitators tonight that are going to bring some fantastic conversation and a depth of knowledge that I'm really looking forward to hearing. And I know our audiences are incredibly engaged in our Count Women In series, and we do strive to have that engagement over Zoom. And so at any time we have a Q&A function in Zoom, and we just ask that you put your questions and comments in there. And if you like a particular question, it really resonates with you, just use the thumbs up, and that tells us that folks really want to have that answer. We are also recording tonight's event because we do want to make sure that folks have access to it from that sort of perspective of inclusion. And we'll be sharing it online following the event. So if you prefer to remain anonymous in your questions and comments, please do so. You have that option. And so that's kind of it from me. And I'd like to actually introduce one of our co-moderators for tonight. And if you were in our September session, you would have also seen her moderate. So we have Tony Minhas, who is one of our board members. And she's got fantastic experience working with multicultural groups and socioeconomically diverse communities, providing client-centered services and advocacy. Tony is the co-founder of the Sat Ring Foundation, an organization dedicated towards increasing accessibility of community services for racialized communities. She's been recognized in many places by the University of Calgary as a distinguished alumni, and in 2018 was named in the Think for Action's top 20 under 25 Calgarians. We're so fortunate to have Tony on our board, and I'd like to hand it over to her to really start us off for tonight. Thank you, Tony.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you for that introduction, Jillian and baby Frankie. It's always great when we have Franklin join us. And I am beyond excited about today's discussion. So despite it being 2020, women still shoulder more family duties and face different expectations than men when it comes to professional or family roles. To help us break down these complex stereotypes, we're grateful to have our amazing panel here to lead a conversation on how these societal expectations can impact female candidates. So I'm going to jump right in and introduce our panel. Our first panelist is Pam Krause. She has been president and CEO of the Calgary Centre for Sexuality for nearly 20 years, and is an advocate and activist on issues related to equality and social justice. Next, we have Dr. Susan Francisquet, who is a U of C professor with the Department of Political Science, focusing on women's political representation and gender, as well as public policy. Last but not least, we have Leslie Taylor, who was elected the first mayor of Banff in 1989 and has also served as town councillor. She is now the principal at Rothbone Taylor Consulting. And finally, I want to introduce my co-moderator this evening, Dr. Rachel Pettigrew. Dr. Pettigrew is an associate professor of general management and human resources in Bissett School for Business at Mount Royal University. With a deep commitment to social justice, Rachel's primary research focuses on organizational culture and policies surrounding employees' work-life responsibilities, with a specific focus on gender and gender role norms. Dr. Pettigrew has over 15 years of post-secondary teaching experience, is a public speaker, and is regularly engaged with the business community. So please welcome Dr. Pettigrew to kick off our discussion today.
Thank you so much, Tony. Thank you for the kind introduction, and to the whole Ask Her YYC team for inviting me to moderate the panel tonight. I'm thrilled to be here with this incredible panel of women, and I'm very much looking forward to both the conversation and the questions that arise from the attendees. As we know, women entering politics face a number of challenges. In 2019, a report by the Standing Committee on the Status of Women identified 7 barriers to improving representation of women in politics, including financing campaigns and lack of recruitment of female candidates. But the report also identified gender stereotypes and discrimination, gender-based media treatment, and the absence of a female-friendly workplace. As Jillian mentioned, the focus on the event tonight is to explore society's persistent perception of women as primary caregivers for children and or aging family, which acts both as a barrier to women entering politics and also impacts how women are perceived as candidates compared to their male counterparts. But let's begin with some context. Not only does society perceive women as primary caregivers, but women are in fact more likely to provide the care of all types. Despite women's increasing involvement in the workforce and an increase in men's participation in childcare and housework over the last 25 years, women are still doing significantly more housework, childcare, and elder care. For example, Canadian women report substantially more unpaid childcare than men. Mothers perform on average 50 hours of childcare per week compared to fathers reporting 24 hours, so almost double the amount of reported hours. Interestingly, women's hours spent in employment do not significantly influence their weekly hours spent in childcare, unlike it does for men. In addition, women report 7 hours more per week in housework than men. With regards to elder care, research shows that I'm more likely to provide care for my mother-in-law than my husband, her son, right? And more women are leaving the workforce to provide elder care given our aging population. All of these stats point to this societal perception that women are caregivers and therefore perhaps not the prototypical politicians, which can result in pushback or bias, a hurdle women need to overcome when running for office, an obstacle male candidates rarely face. 62% of mothers with children under the age of 13 are in the workforce in Canada, and this makes work-family conflict a pressing concern, and making tools and policies to minimize this conflict essential. The rules of operation found in legislatures and political workplaces were crafted long before women's working outside the home was normalized. So initiatives like parental leave, accommodating caregiving demands, work-life balance, rules and procedures fall short on supporting women with care responsibilities in the political sphere. We have a shortfall of women in the political realm, with only a fifth of Canadian mayors being female, women being drastically underrepresented in municipal politics, especially in Alberta, and only one current female identifying premier in Northwest Territories. Those who are female identifying or gender diverse need to be at the table of these discussions, influencing policies that will support women, families, and beyond. We need more female and diverse representation in politics, and that's why we're here tonight. So let's get started. Okay, so I'm going to start. I look forward to chatting with this amazing panel. I'm going to start and ask a question to the panelists, all three of you. Given that the lack of diversity in leadership is evident in most realms, especially politics, what can we all be doing to ensure we are creating space to change this, especially when we are in positions of influence? Pam, do you want to start?
Sure, and thank you so much for having me join tonight. This is fantastic. So, you know, I think the big thing with a lot of the focus that we've had in the past few years on diversity and inclusion, thinking of LGBTQ rights, thinking of Black Lives Matter, thinking of Indigenous peoples and other people of color. You know, I think one of the things that we have become aware of or should be aware of is the biases that we walk in with into any situation. So, I mean, I think what we've seen is a lot of underrepresentation is because of the assumptions that people make. And so, you know, I think it's really incumbent on each of us as individuals, and if you're the leader in an organization, to really be looking at where are the places that you're not really supporting people of minority populations. What are you doing that is not supporting them? Because in my experience as a lesbian, often what I found is if I wanted to get anywhere, I had to ask for things. So I had to ask for every sort of thing that came, you know, going back to when I was in the workforce, things like same-sex benefits were unheard of to be asked for, and it made you super radical. So if you're facing sort of these very basic barriers, you know, what are the odds if I've come out and people don't like me now because of who I am, that I'm going to try to seek a job, you know, with a boss who I know is homophobic. So, you know, for me, it really starts with, I think, us each looking at our situations of privilege and seeing where we can be more supportive to ensure that leadership is really supported. So the work that you're doing at Ask Her YYC around mentorship, it's key. Not everybody has access to that. Lots of people do in certain types of work, and in less formal work situations, for example, mentorship isn't formalized. So how do you go about getting it? So those are some of the things that I think that I've really been enlightened about, is just being really careful about those assumptions and what role we can actively play in encouraging people and encouraging young people to want to be leaders, because I think that's, you know, our hope for the future. So thank you.
Pam, I mean, I think my research over the last 10 or 12 years has focused on parental leave. And one of the things that you mentioned, workplaces and policy, and depending on how organizations structure their policy or legislated policy is crafted, can actually be discriminatory against same-sex dads or same-sex moms.
Yeah.
And so, for example, many organizations top up maternity leave, but not parental leave, which disadvantages same-sex fathers, right? So I think that is one of the things that I push for, which is with representation from the LGBTQ2+ community, super important to be at the table for crafting those
Yes.
policies, because otherwise that doesn't even dawn on people. And that's both in the legislature, but also in organizations.
That's right.
So
That's
yeah,
right.
yeah. How about Leslie?
Well, I think that one of the things that came to mind first for me was changing the way work is done. And you alluded to this briefly when you talked about female-friendly workplaces. I think that there are all kinds of things in politics that make it very difficult for parents. You know, meetings, do they have to end at an unpredictable time? Do mayors really need to go and sit through an endless dinner in order to welcome a conference? The way that work is done has such a huge impact on women or anybody in a parental role, actually. And so the structure of work is important. And I find it fascinating that with the pandemic, we've done so much so quickly to change the structure of work. All kinds of things that everybody thought couldn't be done are being done. So that one's important to me. Another one that I think is really important, and Pam touched on this, I think, is the importance of civil discourse. Women and minorities are disproportionately impacted when we have an atmosphere in which people feel free to insult their elected representatives. And so what can we do? Well, of course, you know, we can model civil discourse, but the other thing and the harder thing is, as citizens or as people of influence, we have to call out the uncivil discourse when we see it. And that is a hard thing to do, because the minute you do that, you're either accused of being sensitive or you become a target yourself. But we just all have to do it, because if we don't get in there and call that kind of thing out, it's going to continue. The other thing that came to my mind when I thought about this question is, if you are a person of influence, you have to look for ways to share your experience, but also to share your spotlight. If you're, for example, the mayor, you can choose to have a committee chair speak about an important issue, or you can choose to have an up-and-coming young counselor speak about an important issue. And you're sharing your spotlight. Heaven knows you've got enough spotlight. You should spread it around a little bit in order to create space for the next group of leaders. I've got a bunch more, but I'll stop there for now.
Thank you. That's an incredible list, and I want to hear the rest of it. Yeah, one thing that rung with me is that COVID and our really quick pivot in our workplaces, but it also, with regards to accessibility to childcare, with many of our childcares closing, it really influenced, and it showed us how crucial childcare is within our, keeping women engaged, either in politics or in industry or in service work, right? So, yeah, and I do agree, we have to call it out when we see it. Do you have any other, Susan, did you have any thoughts on how people of influence might be able to drive diversity in leadership?
Yeah, I think there are three things that we can do to diversify leadership. The first is exactly what Ask Her YYC is doing, and that is to ask and invite people. And one of the reasons this is so important is that research shows that women especially tend to underestimate their qualifications. And of course, the flip side is that men overestimate their qualifications. And I just want to say here that all of this talk about how women underestimate and women aren't sufficiently politically ambitious or don't have political ambition, I really want to make it a mission, and I would like more folks to flip it around and instead be talking about how men have a tendency to overestimate their qualifications, and that men's level of political ambition it shouldn't be the norm against which women are judged as deficient. But in any case, one of the things we need to do is all get used to telling women, and especially young women and racialized women, that they have skills and qualities that would make them a good candidate. And that links to the second thing that I think we need to do, and that is we need to change the conversation about what makes someone qualified for political office or to run for political office. So our society continues to take the kinds of characteristics of white, middle and upper class men as the model of what a politician should look like. And what that means is that a lot of women might not consider themselves qualified to run for office because maybe they didn't start a successful, or they don't run a successful business, or they're not super assertive or competitive. But if we start to think about, and there's loads of evidence to show this, if we start to think about what voters actually want out of their elected representatives, what they value in elected representatives, well, they value people who can listen, people who can relate to the kinds of day-to-day struggles that they face and who understand what needs to be done. And so what we need to realize is that women, precisely for all the reasons that Rachel was talking about earlier, about the caring work that women do, we have to think about those experiences that women are often more likely to have. That is, figuring out, and I went through this as well, when my dad had to go into a long-term care home, all of a sudden I had to start, doing research and figuring out what this meant. And women are far more likely to interact with their children's school, with their families' healthcare providers. And so all of these experiences need to be considered a form of qualifications, right? So being qualified to run for office doesn't mean that you've started a business, or that you, have the right, that you're in the right networks to go, golfing with certain people and all of that sort of things. What also matters is the experience that gives you insight into the problems that people are actually experiencing. And then the third thing that I wanted to say links, I think, to what Leslie said, and that is that this actually might be the hardest thing, but that is people who are in positions of influence need to make space for women. And sometimes that means that those of us who are used to being in certain spaces may need to think, maybe I need to step aside. I need to give up that space. And so that means men making room for women. And it also means white women making room for women of color and Indigenous women. But doing so also means something else. And this is what I think all of us could do, is have at the ready a list of names to recommend. So when there is when you hear about an opportunity come up, and I really like what Leslie was saying about, giving space and allowing, a young new counselor to speak instead of putting a chair as someone who always, someone who might be more senior. We all need to have at the ready names of maybe young women or racialized or Indigenous women, and then give those names out as recommendations. So it always helps to have them at the ready, to think of, and this often means thinking about who that might be even before you're asked. And that's something I think concrete that we can all do. Thanks.
Yeah. Great. Thank you, Susan. That was fantastic. I think you and I are of like minds. When you're talking about reframing, we often have historically, as women enter the workforce en masse in the 60s and 70s, we talk about women fitting into structure, that whole like lean in approach of fitting into the workplace as is, when really we need to create a more family friendly workplace, because women have care responsibilities, but so do men. And so we need to create together a better workforce, and just like we need to create like a better body politic around supporting people. And I absolutely believe in creating space. And I think that is actually an actionable item we can all do. Thank you for that. So I'm actually going to ask you the next question, Susan. So given that you are currently working on a project entitled The Motherhood Dilemma, which I want to know all about this, in parliamentary politics. Can you explain to our attendees what is the motherhood dilemma and what does that mean for politics in Canada or Alberta?
Okay, well, this is this research project that I've really just started working on, called The Motherhood Dilemma in Parliamentary Politics, relates to some of the things that have already been raised by several of you, and that is the fact that politics is very family unfriendly. And so clearly, if we think about the dilemma that I'm talking about here from a diversity perspective, we don't just want more women in politics, we want more women who bring diverse experiences into politics. And that of course means we need to have women who have had experiences of motherhood. Interestingly though, the research in political science shows quite clearly that women who are elected compared to their male colleagues are less likely to be parents. So there's this sort of tension, right? That you want women with experiences of motherhood, but on the other hand, because the way political institutions are structured, it's very difficult. So, and in fact, I would say that parliaments are probably the world's most family unfriendly workplace. And so, Rachel, you talked about the rules and procedures. So one of the things we know is that and this isn't just in Canada, but in several countries around the world that I've looked at, elected officials are not considered employees the same way, you know, nurses or university professors or administrators are. That is, they don't pay into the Social Security funds out of which parental leave is paid. So they're not eligible for maternity leave or parental leave. But even if they do, say, negotiate with their political party or their institution that they're going to take some time off, it's not really such a simple matter, because one of the things that most institutions require is that voting be done in person. So even if you're able to negotiate some kind of a leave, you'd have to be present if you want to vote. And if you're not present to vote, then that raises all kinds of questions about, you know, well, who's representing your constituency? The other thing that you might have been alluding to earlier when you talked about the rules is that most legislatures have rules about who can enter and who can't. And we know that, you know, elected women who have tried to bring their infants in the chamber, whether to breastfeed or simply because all of a sudden a vote is called and they have their infant with them, so they've tried to go in the chamber. There's stories from, well, it's happened in Canada, but it's happened in several other countries around the world, that they've been prevented from entering because there are often rules that prevent, you know, sometimes it's called visitors, sometimes it's strangers, are not allowed in these institutions. Now, I should say that on the positive side, and this is what I'm looking at in my research, which is I plan to, once I can travel to do research again, I actually plan to study 6 different countries, including Canada. But there have been some positive changes. So I think so far the British Parliament has gone the farthest with adopting parental leave, and so not just new parents can take leave, but they've also implemented a system of proxy voting. So when you're not able to come to the Parliament because you're on leave, you can give your vote to someone else in your party who will vote on your behalf. And then there's several other parliaments that are changing the rules to allow infants in the chamber, as long as they're with their parent who is an elected member. And this is starting slowly to happen in some places in Canada, in provincial legislatures, and I believe the Edmonton City Council is allowing parental leave. But as far as I can tell, there's not a single legislature in Canada, at least, that has yet adopted proxy voting. So they still haven't solved the problem of, well, how would you vote if you're on parental leave? And that's where the pandemic is so interesting, because somebody, was it Pam or Leslie that talked about the pandemic giving all these opportunities? You know now you can do these things, right? Parliaments, there's various legislatures and parliaments that are doing things like remote voting. What I'm really looking at is how this works, and B, what kind of pushback are we going to get? Because already some of my research is starting to show that you have, I'll just call them traditionalists, who say that voting in person is an integral part of parliamentary procedures, and it's how the deliberative democratic process works. So there's a little bit of an uphill battle for, I think, progressive folks who would like to see proxy voting or remote voting or televoting or something like that as a way to allow parental leave. They have to deal with these I was about to say conservatives, but just traditionalists, I'll say, because I don't want to put any party labels to it, but those who say that, oh, if we do something like this, it's just the slippery slope to devaluing and downgrading our democratic institutions. So, but this is all something I'm really watching for.
Yeah, I look forward to that research. It sounds amazing. I think often that pushback is actually a way to maintain the status quo in personal power or positional power, but also like systemic barriers for a more diverse pool of people to take place, right? So kind of the opposite of like allowing space is kind of maintaining that space so that people can't enter. And I'll be interested with my work on dads, I'll be interested to see if we have an increased exposure to fatherhood in the political realm, whether or not that will ease stigma on female politicians. It would actually be the people that hold those positions of power kind of driving for that change, and then women benefiting from that, but everybody benefiting, because dads that are in politics want to be home for their kids' Christmas concert or holiday concert as well, right? Yeah, thank you for the discussion. All right, so in 2016, Bill C-16 was amended to include gender identity and gender expression to the list of prohibitive grounds of discrimination in the Canadian Human Rights Act. Can you speak to, Pam, can you speak to the importance of this amendment and making politics more accessible to transgender, non-binary, or gender non-conforming candidates, and what else needs to be done?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I come from the days of LGBTQ rights, when LGBTQ Albertans didn't have any, and we had to go to the Supreme Court of Canada to be included. And so to see how long it took from 1998, how long it took for transgender rights to be included in our Human Rights Acts, I think is terrible. But here we are, we finally, we had governments that made that happen. We all know this, like that's one part of change. There's that part, there's institutional and individual. And so it's a great step forward. But at the work we do at the Center for Sexuality, every single day, transgender, gender non-conforming or non-binary people are misgendered. There are youth in schools who don't go to the bathroom for the whole day because there isn't a bathroom that represents their gender. Or they're afraid to go in. So for me, I think we have to be really aware that nothing is really done by only one part of those things happening. And so I'm just going to do a call out right now to, for example, our friend Anna Murphy, who's involved in Ask Her YYC, who's running for city council. And that is so amazing because this is an amazing trailblazer. And that's what we need to see. So, I think that there, as always, it's that leadership and the great conversation that's already happened tonight from people with such vast experience is really about that. What are we doing to create the space? But then what are we doing behind the scenes to make sure that people have that equal footing to be able to participate? So, if you're misgendered at the door every single time you go to a door, like that's going to break you down. So what is the support being provided? Because there's nothing you can do to change voters at the doorstep, but what's the support being provided to make sure that campaigns are really aware of transgender rights, of using proper pronouns? It's it's the on the ground stuff, and so much around the stuff that we've talked about around women is exactly the same. If you don't see yourself represented, it's way harder. If you don't have the kind of support you actually need, and I don't think it's anything in particular, it's much more individual. But it is things like one of the political parties has a fund for women, and what the women use it for when they're candidates, it goes across the board to all the candidates. What they use it for is whatever they want. It might be an outfit, it might be a haircut, it might be childcare, or it could be a whole host of other things. It's what that woman wants. And so we need to individualize what people need to be able to be in politics. And then we need to figure out the ways that we, as people who might be organizers or providing that support. And then if people get elected, we have to make sure that the support is there institutionally, that we have gender neutral washrooms, things like that. So it's a really interesting one for me, because the legislation in this case is such the first part of what we need to continue to
Yeah.
do.
Great discussion. And I think I often feel like, we're encouraging people to enter, but then the organizational culture has not evolved, right?
Yeah.
So we really need to be working internally on that culture to prepare and be ready to make space for people. And that's not, when I say that, not at all a delay tactic, but to recognize that the candidacy is the one step, and then existing within what might be an inhospitable culture is a whole nother area. How can one of the questions that I see in the chat was talking about champion people who are of diverse backgrounds. Like, how can we champion voices that are from the LGBTQ2+ community?
Well, I think both Leslie and Susan spoke to this so incredibly well. Make space. Get out of the way. Make sure that you are, for me, it's all about encouraging people to be leadership, to build that confidence, to be able to speak their truth. And so I think it really starts with making that space. And again, providing all of those individual sort of supports or mentorship or whatever, but make it really individual about what people need, not saying if you're an X person, clearly this is what you would need to be able to participate, because it doesn't really work that way.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think we all need to continue to educate terminology, other things, educate ourselves. It's ever changing, and making sure that we're current in holding respectful space is really important too. Thank you for that. Moving to Leslie, I mentioned in the introduction the 2019 report for the Standing Committee on the Status of Women, which focused on improving representation. The report identified several barriers for women, including gender stereotypes and biased treatment in the media. You were first elected the mayor of Banff in 1989, congratulations, and 18 years later served on the town council. What was your experience, and did you notice any changes in social perception or expectations for women in politics during that time frame?
Yeah, the changes were fairly massive, but I should start out by clarifying that I think I had an easier ride than many women do, because I think Banff is a very progressive community, and so that I'll just put that out there and say that perhaps my life wasn't as hard as lots of people's. But yes, when I was elected as mayor for my first 2 terms, I was the only woman, myself and 6 councillors who were men. By the time I came back 18 years later and served 2 terms as a councillor, the first term it was 4 women out of 7 council, and the second term it was 3. So I've read somewhere years ago that once it gets up to be around a third women start to feel comfortable. And I would say that in my experience, that's certainly true. Having said that though, I think that I can't sort of stereotype the men that I served with in the early 90s, because I think they were very supportive to me. I was younger than all of them, and I was the only woman. And they could have been a real pain, but they weren't. And so I want to give them credit for that. I think if I look at the changes between the two terms, of course, women leaders were more common by the time I got reelected in 2007. In my term as mayor, I had a constant problem with visitors from other countries wanting to introduce me as the mayoress. And I'd have to explain that a mayoress is a mayor's wife, and I'm not the mayor's wife. And, you know, that kind of thing doesn't happen now, but it did happen then. I think that also I noticed over time that media coverage focused a lot less on the fact that I was a woman and a lot more on what I was saying. I think part of that was because I was older the second time around. When I was elected mayor, I had an 18-month-old, and then at the end of my first term, I gave birth to our daughter. So there was a certain amount of interest, which I think was not unexpected, in, you know, how on earth is she doing this with these small children? So there were always a lot of questions around that. And of course, the men who had children didn't get those questions, but I think it was kind of natural. That goes away as time goes on. And also, of course, in the later term, I was dealing with a lot more women reporters as well as other women leaders. So that made a difference. Another thing that I think was very positive in change over time was the increase in access to data for decision making. A couple of you have made reference to the fact that women are very modest about their abilities. And part of that, I think, is a tendency for new women leaders to be more likely to question their judgment and to question their decision making and to always be asking, you know, should I really be here? Am I making the right decisions? And one of the nice things more recently is that you do have a lot of access to the data and information that let you decide that you're doing okay. That wasn't so much the case in the early 90s. Of course, the other big change and the negative one that I have to mention, and I've mentioned it earlier, is just the degree of, or the nature of the discourse and the way that people frame you online. That didn't exist in the early 90s. Most people who wanted to criticize what I was doing would come and yell at me from the visitors gallery. And it wasn't pleasant, but when I think about it, the fact that people mostly had to do it face to face, or they had to do it by letter, which made them think a little bit about what they were saying, that made the discourse slightly different. More recently, people can immediately fire off something, calling you names, telling you you're an idiot. They don't think about what they're doing. It's kind of anonymous. They're doing it from behind their screen. And there is no question that women and minorities take more criticism of that sort. And people will always tell you, oh, well, you're in politics, you should expect it. I don't think you should expect it. I wouldn't do it to somebody, and I don't see why anybody should do it to anybody. I don't think you get good political decision-making out of yelling at a politician online and calling them names. That doesn't improve what they're doing for you, and it doesn't make for a good civic environment. So that would be the negative change. But in general, over time, the change was positive. And in case anybody's wondering why on earth I would start out as mayor and then come back years later and serve as a councillor, I'll just mention that the nice thing about being a councillor is that you can concentrate on policy and you don't have to go to all the ribbon cuttings and dinners and things. And for me, because I'm a real policy wonk and that's what I care about, is getting things done, not giving speeches and getting applause, being a councillor was really great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, amazing. I love this discussion. I think we need another 4 hours of this. I know we don't have it. Yeah, you made me, when you were talking about women opting in or out of political life, the stats are there for industry as well. So I think the statistic is that women will apply for a job where they meet 100% of the requirements, and men will feel confident applying for a job where they meet 60%. And so I think it's been a similar strand with Susan kind of reframing kind of the overconfidence versus the underconfidence. It's also that idea that we're thinking critically and maybe avoiding groupthink and other kinds of things by challenging that. But you're right that the online environment, I mean, people say things and do things when you don't have to do it face to face. Somebody would have had to get in their car, drive to the town hall, walk into the building, and they have lots of time to kind of second guess their decision, right? But the new online environment does create ripe environment for those kind of conflicts. And I think it is one of, and maybe all of you can speak to this, but I think it is one of the things that kind of scares women. It's about that pushback. And I often think that it's in those spaces where you're getting the pushback, where you know you're making a difference because something's changing, right? Okay, I'm going to pose a final question to all of you, and then we'll open it up to participant questions because we're dying to hear what you want to ask as well. So the question posed to all of you is, I mentioned earlier how representation is crucial to the development of policies that support the needs of all individuals in the social fabric, especially those that are female identifying, marginalized, or racialized. In the past 50 years, women's progress in voting, political engagement has come a long way in a relatively short amount of time. More and more women are voting in their own self-interest and developing independent political ideologies. What might this mean for the diversity of candidates or for voting patterns moving forward? So maybe we'll start with Leslie.
Well, I think one thing we should keep in mind is that you can't always, if you're voting in women's self-interest, for example, as you said, you can't always tell which way a person's policies are going to go by looking at them. So I can find lots of examples of male politicians who are conscious of and supportive of issues that are called women's issues. Similarly, I can find women politicians that take positions that I personally would consider to be contrary to the interests of most women that I know. So just by how someone looks at the table doesn't always tell you what they're going to do. But in general, a range of voices at the table leads to a range of interests being considered, and that's really important. I think that the really difficult position is always going to be the person who is at the pointy end. There always need to be people who come in not because the issues they care about are represented and are being discussed at the table, but because the issues that matter to them are not being discussed or addressed. And that's a very difficult position to be in when you're the first person or the first couple of people to be saying this thing that you are not considering at all is an issue based on my lived experience, and here's why. That's a tough position to be in. A little later on, when those issues are on the table and they've been discussed, that creates a more welcoming environment for other people to bring their voices as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yes, totally agree on that. Pam, do you want to weigh in on this?
Sure. So, I think COVID has been so interesting when we look at these issues, seeing things like childcare being considered in the economic realm as well in the social, what we would call the social realm, or women's issues. And one of the things I think for this government is, when they've thrown in tidbits around about not just having an economic recovery, but having a social recovery as well. And for me, that's what it's about, and really is what you were talking about, I think, Leslie, is it's not about it being women's issues. It's being conscious of the social consequences of the economic decisions or the economic consequences of the social decisions. My work forever has been in the prevention space. And, it all is very tied up to tell people it costs so much more to have the problem, then like that's how we have to be able to look at things, to be able to really recognize the wide realm. And, it absolutely is, killing me that women's participation in labor, in the economy, has had such an incredible hit over the time of COVID. And what's that recovery going to look like? This is economic. So that's what I think is, and I think all of you have also pointed out, men care about this. It's just that there seems to be only one way of talking about things, right? It's what we're supposed to lead with. Well, what'll be the impact on taxes? Like, is that really what we need to talk about? We need to talk about the impact of older adults and how they're affecting each one of our lives, because we have to start making decisions about the next part of their lives. So like, that's what I think is kind of missing, is the rhetoric is about it's one or the other, but it needs to be actually super connected, for us to be able to actually see the whole picture of how the world works and what affects us and what always affects us. And when you think about things like municipal politics, you are dealing with, with everything that affects every person's life, right? When they turn on their tap in the morning, when they, like these are economic things, but when we cancel bus routes and then women can't get to work, that's super real. And so there is an impact, and maybe that's a decision we make, but we have to think that's a decision we're making that's going to impact the, people's ability to participate in all of the.
Yeah, and it's those ripple impacts, right? Like, we make that decision and then it ripples in the water, the multiple things. And sometimes if we don't have people on the table that have taken the bus to work, or the train, or if we don't have people from diverse backgrounds or socioeconomic backgrounds in those spaces, they don't even know the consequences, right? I want to ask you a follow-up question, because there's a question in the dialogue box here that says, how do we engage? Because you kind of touched on this. How do we engage the men in our lives, partners, colleagues, employers, friends, in having these important conversations? Because you kind of touched on that, but what would your approach be to engaging that?
Well, I don't know that the person knows, but so at the Center for Sexuality, we have a program called Wise Guys for 14-year-old boys. And so, what we're doing is we're trying to talk to young men about how they can do stuff differently. So it's really this, we've been doing this program for 10 years. The outcomes are amazing. And what we're really looking at, what I talk about is, how do we get the young men that we work with to move from being passive in society's issues to being active bystanders in the social issues that affect them, that affect the women around them, that affect the people around them. So, I think we need to really, again, put men into that place of not making an assumption. I'm really interested in your work, Rachel, because that's what we see is the barriers for men then in being different, or our employers wanting workers to be different. So, I think it starts with, but I think with men, it's that same thing. Don't make an assumption that they don't care about this stuff. Don't make an assumption that they aren't willing to create different spaces. We've had, hundreds of young men in the Wise Guys program in Calgary area. Hopefully, some of them are seeing the world differently or starting to play a different role. So I think it's a both and, sort of helping with young men to really look at their masculinities and the effects it has on them. And then also, opening that door for them to participate and put some of that responsibility, in conversation or in action.
Yeah, and I totally agree. I feel like you and I need to have coffee. I think it's one of those things where my work on men's use of parental leave, male involvement at the early stages of a child's life is so crucial. And we need to recognize that, we've had all of this push on like women in STEM and women in other, but we haven't had the same weight and effort in pushing men into care spheres and pushing, recognizing that men, care about these or should care about these care topics as well. So a huge advocate and great work with the work you do at Wise Guys. It's so important. And then finally, I'll turn to Susan. So what might this mean for diversity of candidates or voting patterns in the future, the shift for women in engagement in politics and voting?
Well, I think I'll just say a little bit about what the research tells us about the impact of having a more diverse set of office holders. So I would say that the research is pretty clear that it matters. It matters a lot. So it matters not only for putting new issues on the policy agenda, but very much, in line with what Leslie was saying, that, this is often quite challenging when you enter in an institution that people haven't been talking about these things before. It's often difficult to do so. So some of the research on the policy impact of diversity comes up or is somewhat ambivalent, right? in that they, you know, a lot of scholars find that it's actually hard to make a difference in policy terms. But what I am always most excited by is the enormous research findings that are starting to look at the broader societal impact or the impact on citizens of having more diverse diverse decision-making bodies. So there's a couple of things I want to talk about. First of all, there's research that shows that when we know when women and girls don't see themselves reflected in institutions, then they think, well, yeah, politics is just for men. So there is research out there that finds that having more elected women can increase girls' political ambition, or their likelihood of talking about politics, being interested in politics, voting. But what's also really interesting, and there's been several studies more recently that find that it doesn't just matter for girls and women, it also changes how men think about political institutions. So there have been studies that have found that both men and women, their trust in government, their belief in the legitimacy of political institutions improves when there are more women present, and when you start to get to more balanced and diverse decision-making bodies. So there's been some experimental research that finds, and I love the title of this one article was about all male panels. And by that, they meant all male panels of like legislative panels, right? Legislative committees that are making decisions. And so it was an experiment. It was an experiment where people had to, you know, judge as legitimate or illegitimate, and then also judge the outcome, whether the outcome was good or bad. And they found that people were less satisfied with the outcome when it was an outcome that was made by an all-male panel. And they also, and importantly, it wasn't just women that were that felt this way, it was men as well. So this is the shorthand here, or the takeaway is that if we don't get more diversity in our political institutions, that's just going to further erode legitimacy and trust in our political institutions. And we're at a point now in I mean, it's not quite as bad in Canada as it is south of the border or in many European countries, but our political institutions just can't take any more hits, right? This is something that we need to do, right? Institutions need to be more diverse. It's what makes people feel that they have some buy-in. And I think that actually, no, I'm just going to stop. I was going to say something else, but I'm just going to stop now and open it up to others.
I feel like we could all talk about this for hours. I love it. I think it's a fantastic discussion. Yeah, and I think too, I mean, our Canadian fabric is with the immigration, and we're going to rely on immigration to maintain with our lower fertility rates, and as they continue to drop slightly, we're going to be relying on immigration to Canada to maintain economic growth and to support the aging population. As an immigrant myself, I always feel like that diversity at the top needs to be representative of the diversity at the bottom, right? So, and I think as that changes and evolves, absolutely those spaces need to be filled. And that's fantastic research. That's really interesting research on panels and perception of that. It's kind of, it touches on groupthink a little bit, that we're subconsciously thinking about people thinking all the same and questioning their judgment on that. So with all of that, thank you for your amazing comments and responses to questions. I'm going to turn it over to Tony, my fabulous co-moderator, and she's going to take over some questions that have been in the group chat from participants.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rachel, for leading that fascinating discussion. That was great to listen to. I'm going to jump right in with our first question, especially trying to be mindful of time. And I am hoping to actually start with Rachel's answer for this question. So it's a big question, and I'd like to go around the room. So if there is one policy that you can think of that you think would be a game changer for women's access to politics, what would that policy be?
Oh my, put your co-moderator on the spot. You know, I think meaningful family-friendly policies some of the things that Susan was touching on with remote voting and other kinds of things, those policies and procedures, the ability, one of the major, especially for federal politics, is the requirement to travel so much. And so that really rules out people that don't want to be away from young children. And so I think for me, changing some of those infrastructure. I mean, of course, in an ideal world, I would say universal healthcare, or not healthcare, but universal childcare. But I also think just changing how those policies and practices would be fundamentally important, especially at that national level.
Amazing, thank you. Next, I'll jump to Leslie, if you'd like to weigh in on that question. One policy.
Yeah, I have to agree with Rachel, and I'm doing it from personal experience. When I was coming close to the end of my time as mayor, a provincial party wanted to recruit me to run for MLA. And it really was strictly because of the way that the work is structured that I couldn't even consider it. There was no way that I was going to be driving back and forth to Edmonton with 2 small children in Banff. It just wasn't going to happen. And yet, the actual work, as we see now in the pandemic, the actual work doesn't always have to be done in a room in Edmonton for provincial government. So of all the things that stop women, the structure of the work and the way it's always been done is the thing that I think is the biggest obstacle.
Absolutely.
And sorry, if I can just add, I think it was Susan who made the point that we think of these as obstacles to women, but it actually is about a family-friendly workplace, a socially friendly workplace, a place that a normal person could want to be. And there's a lot about the work of a politician at the provincial or the national level that is just so punishing to work-life balance that it's an immediate obstacle for any person.
Absolutely. Thank you for that insight, Leslie. I think this COVID era has kind of been very eye-opening for accessibility in certain ways too, because we're doing things that we never thought we could. So next, I'd like to jump to Pam with that question. One policy.
Well, I always learn things. So I learned from Susan tonight. So it really is parental leave for legislators. Like, I think, all of those things that can be a consideration when you're thinking about employment. One of the things probably would be, what kind of leave would I get if I had a child? And at the legislature, it's like, oh, you don't get any. And to your point, Susan, the interesting thing about, and then at what point are you no longer performing your duties? So actually be able to have some way of not having to do that for a time. So I think, everything that everyone said, and I think that would be, if we were going to do a single one, that might be my one.
Wonderful, thank you. And then Susan, what are your thoughts?
So I think parental leave and making parliaments more family friendly would be great. But I'll go out on a limb here and say, if we make parliaments more family friendly, which I do think we should do, but that might have the effect of making it easier for men too. And then that might actually make it harder for women because the men will take all the jobs. So my one policy, gender quotas. This is something that is just not on the public agenda very much in Canada, to my great disappointment. So I should just point out that all of my past research, or most of my past research on women in politics, has not been on Canada. I started out doing research on women in politics in Latin America, which sort of led the way in the world to adopting gender quotas. Now, I think pretty much every country save for Guatemala, I think, is the only country in Latin America that does not require political parties to run a slate of, I think, at a minimum 30%, and there's several Latin American countries that have parity laws. In other words, parties will not be allowed to compete in the elections. Party lists will be disqualified if they do not have 50% of their candidates women. And so if you look at the rankings of the countries in the world that have large portions of women in elected women, a lot of them are in Latin America, or they're European countries that have gender quotas. There's a lot of European countries with gender quotas, Africa, Asia, the Middle East. So one thing that my research on women and electoral office tells me, and there's lots of other research, is that if you don't make parties select women, they often won't. And they'll often say, oh, we tried, but women just don't want to run. And so part of the fact that there is evidence that women are possibly more hesitant to run for office than men. But if you force parties to run women, they will find them. I mean, because they do, right? We look around the world, other countries with quotas, they find them. So that's my one policy.
Amazing. I actually took 2 of your classes in my undergrad, so I was really curious if that was going to be your answer, because I remember having a lot of those conversations. So thank you. So our next question, and I will jump to Pam for this one first. So this question is about, as women, should we be assertive and risk being called all the names that come with being assertive? And how do we find a balance? And how can we tactfully call out the cruelty that, Leslie referred to earlier as well?
Well, I started involved in politics. I was the city councilor in Calgary, Bev Longstaff. I was her first aldermanic assistant in 1989. And so I was part of the, got to witness like the Sue Higgins, for those of you who aren't quite as young, the sort of Sue Higgins style of politics is how it was, where she wore pantsuits and, and she talked, she said the F word a lot, but she was like the most kind and lovely woman as well. But there was an era, there were 2 city councilors at the time who they really were seen as being aggressive, I'll say. And then Bev came along and sort of started being a little bit different in kind of how she interacted, and then men didn't know what to do because she was very assertive and really friendly and really, like, it was really interesting to watch. I think we are, with many different leadership roles of women. I mean, again, we need to move beyond, if you are, assertive, you're a bitch. If you're like, I think it's such, again, we just have to think about Donald Trump probably this very minute and how he's acting. Like the way that aggression and all of those things are framed, I think is tragic, because to be able to state your case and to be able to make a point and be able to, put together a good argument should not have anything to do with gender, with, one person is out of control and the other person is just being who they are. So I think we do need to, back to what Leslie, again, I've learned so much tonight, what Leslie said, we need to engage in civil discourse regardless of who we are. And that's what we need to start setting as the bottom line, is having an opinion and stating it. Shouldn't people starting to freak out. So yeah, I think that it's about all of us engaging differently.
Absolutely. Thank you for that answer. And then Susan, I'll go to you next.
That is a really good question, and it's a really tough one to answer, because there's no easy answer. So the reality is that gender roles are such that, and gender norms are so deeply embedded still in society, that women in politics face a real double bind. There really is a set of double standards, and we see it over and over. We can all think about some anecdotes of political women. Hillary Clinton getting criticized for being too ambitious and not likable. Women who, behave in a certain way, maybe show their more feminine side, and then they're considered not fit for leadership. So the challenge for women in politics, and I'm sure this is true for women in business or in the STEM fields, it's real. And so just last week, I think, or not too long ago, there was a story about the whole lean in thing, the Sheryl Sandberg, that there is a lot of research that shows that this might not be the best advice for women all the time, because there's backlash when women demand too much, right? So the idea that women should just act like men and go marching into your boss's office and say, I need a raise, that can be quite counterproductive, right? That doesn't mean, so this is all really depressing, and I hate being, I don't want to be a downer here, but the reality is that we need to be careful the kind of advice that we give, and women in politics or women in male dominated spheres need to always be mindful of navigating those gender norms, because as much as you're trying to display or prove that you have the characteristics that are expected for that role, you have to do that while also not violating too much the gender norms that people expect, because then you can face that kind of sanctioning. Now, and you need to do all of that while trying to disrupt some of those gender norms. So the really depressing part is that women have to work so much harder, because you both have to, try to navigate this difficulty while also trying to carve out that space. The only thing that I'll say, I'll try to end on a slightly more optimistic note, is that even though these gender norms are really stubborn and sticky, I think they are slowly starting to change. Some of the research I'm seeing, particularly with the younger generations, not Gen Z, so the sort of younger generation is much more accepting of newer emerging gender norms and less supportive of those traditional norms. So I'm putting all my faith in the much younger generation, and hoping, because it really is unfair to women who want to succeed in politics or business or other fields where behaving like a woman displaying typically feminine characteristics are problematic, but then you're seen as too transgressive, and then there's a negative view of you if you act too much like assertive or demanding or that sort of thing.
Absolutely. Thank you, Susan. And then Leslie, I'm really curious as well on what you think after being like a sitting politician and experiencing those.
I think we saw a real example of what Susan was talking about in the vice presidential debate the other week. You saw Kamala Harris trying to walk those lines and trying not to look threatening, but not to look weak, trying to look cheerful and likable, but at the same time be assertive. And it is a very, very difficult line to walk. Fortunately, this stuff is moving. When I was first in politics, the advice was that you were supposed to act like a man, look like a man, put on the big shoulder pads, and it was just ridiculous. Learn to talk about sports, learn to golf if you don't already golf. Oh, for heaven's sake, what's that got to do with doing the job? Nothing. It's ridiculous. So over time, it has gotten better. It really has. But you will always have people who are looking for a reason not to like you because you don't look like their picture of what a leader should be. And I think another thing I'll say, I think about women, certainly it's true for me, is that the negative feedback, the person that doesn't like you, the person that thinks you're an idiot, those people, you dwell on that a whole lot more than you do on the people that like what you're doing. And I think that's true for all of us. If you give a presentation somewhere and there are feedback sheets, you don't look at the 45 that give you, 5 out of 5. You look at the 2 that said 1 out of 5, I thought she was terrible, and you obsess about those. So do your best to walk the line. Don't obsess about the people that don't like what you're doing, because they're always going to be there. And you can't get things done and have everyone like you at the end of the day.
Wonderful. Thank you for that answer and that, yeah, those wise words. I can definitely relate to that. So keeping time in mind, I do have a final question that I'd like to wrap us up with. So the question is around tactics, strategies, that, you know, us and all of our audience members here can either implement in their individual interactions, or maybe even at a systemic level, things that could break down some of these perceptions and expectations that we've talked about today. And maybe what I'll do is I'll start with Rachel here, and then we'll work around the room here.
Oh, tactics and strategies. There's a couple. One of the ones that I really try to utilize in my own professional career is if I'm sitting around a table at a meeting and a woman across the way says something, I will second that. You know, I will support that and encourage it. I think we need to lift up and celebrate the things that women are saying on Twitter or wherever that is. We need to kind of advocate for. So if the woman at the boardroom table says, this is what I'm feeling, I'll say, you know what, I think that's a really valid point. I think what Brittany is saying needs to be heard by the table, right? So it's like seconding those motions, but also celebrating. And I also think, the last one, I think we have to get okay with having uncomfortable conversations. I think opening space and creating a room for conversations, you know, we were talking about how to engage other people in dialogue around what's important. And I think, you know, getting into, as women, we're kind of socialized to be people pleasers, right? And I think sometimes it's okay to have respectful discussions that challenge people, and also calling a spade at times, like Leslie was saying. So.
Fabulous. Thank you. I can agree with that more. Next, we'll jump to Susan to weigh in on that.
Yeah, I think that those are the idea that we need to sometimes be prepared to feel uncomfortable and to make other people feel uncomfortable is really important. And I think that also means demanding more of men as allies. And sometimes I think that we tend to think about this, and this has come up a few times in the discussion from others, is that we tend to think that these are conversations that we're, you know, mostly having among women. And I think that matters, right? We do need to be having these conversations with women, and it needed to, of course, start out that way, right? The whole Virginia Woolf, a room of one's own. We needed to have that, but I think we're now at the point where there needs to be we need to do a lot more pushing with the men around us, and let them know, especially privileged men, let them know that it's, you know, tell them that they need to open up space for women. And that could be uncomfortable conversations, because I'm cognizant of the fact that this is threatening for some men who had easy access to positions of prestige and power and status and influence, and suddenly now they have to compete with all of these other folks. But we have to also push them to do just that, and that means you know, stepping aside. And yeah,
absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, being okay with discomfort, right? That's so incredibly important. Next, I'll jump to Leslie to weigh in.
I think that a strategy, a tactic that anybody can exercise that makes the world a better place is to look for elected representatives or candidates that are saying things that you think are good, or doing things that you think are good, and then making the extra effort to communicate with them, however briefly, and say, I really like what you're saying about such and such, or I really support what you did about so-and-so. Because we have to have the uncomfortable conversations, but we also have to increase the comfort level on the flip side. And it is so unusual when you're working hard as an elected official to get even that little bit of positive feedback, and it can make your day, it can make your week. And it's so easy to do as a citizen, to look for those things that are going well and say thanks. It's a tactic anybody can exercise. And you want to be an influential person? You'll be an influential person if you're doing that, because you will have made a difference in the life of someone who is struggling to represent you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Leslie. That's, yes, something very, very easy to do that we can all do with sometimes just a click of liking things too, right? And then next we'll move to Pam to wrap us up for today.
Sure. So I happened to see in the chat, one of the things, and I think we should be all really thinking about this all the time, is as we're talking about the barriers or being able to break them down, are we really thinking about it from the perspective of Black, Indigenous, and people of color? So I think of it from myself, that there are so many places I can go and so many things I can do without even thinking about it, and that's not the case. And so I think it's really up to, kind of goes back to what I said at the beginning of the evening. It's really up to us, as allies, to make sure that we're working on breaking down the barriers for other individuals when we have the privileges to do so. So, it certainly is relating to women overall and bringing men in, but really being aware of how this affects other populations. So, thank you.
Thank you, Pam. I really appreciate you touching on kind of the intersectionality of our experiences, right? We kind of all walk around this world experiencing different things. So thank you. So thank you for this wonderful, insightful conversation. I'm going to pass it on to Helen, who oversees our events on our board, and she's going to wrap us up for this evening.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tony. And I just want to say, I hope that everyone here who was able to join us found tonight's discussion as interesting and informative, as I did. I'd like to thank everyone for attending tonight's virtual event, and continuing to support Ask Her and our goal of getting more women elected for the 2021 municipal election, now that we're a year out. I'd just like to say a round of thank you. So I'd really like to thank Dr. Rachel Pettigrew and Tony Minhas for moderating tonight's discussion and doing a fantastic job of exploring some really, really interesting themes. And I'd also like to thank Pam Krause, Dr. Susan Frankish-Skett, and Leslie Taylor for joining us tonight and sharing their experiences and expertise. I'd also like to give a huge shout out to our organizers, so Tony, Brooke Campbell, and Karen Van Thine for putting tonight's event together. When we first kicked off our Count Women in Events series in December 2019, it was a very different world. And so 4 events and 1 pandemic later, we've had a chance to hear from 16 panelists and moderators and welcome over 200 attendees to participate in these discussions. And we're hoping through highlighting some of the challenges that women face, such as sexism, social media harassment, or societal expectations and gender roles, that we can equip candidates with the necessary tools and support to be successful, and allowing them to experience all of the joys that come with elected office. So we're now less than a year out from the 2021 election. And as this series has shown, it's going to take a lot of work to get us to a city council that reflects the diversity of Calgary. And so one of the ways that we're looking to attract more women into politics is through our new initiative, which is the Parity Cup. This fun Battle of Alberta has already been attracting some media attention, as Ask Her YYC we're going head to head with Edmonton's Parity YEG in a friendly social media competition to highlight the need for more women city councillors and also get more folks involved. So the Parity Cup is going to run between now and the 2021 election, and it will include regular challenges. The first one will be launching on November 1st in order to keep this in the public eye. So you can check out our website, and we've also posted a link in the chat to sign up as a super fan so that you can stay updated. And that is one of the ways that we're tracking who's winning between Edmonton and Calgary. So if you dislike Edmonton, I recommend signing up as a super fan. And so additionally, we're getting a lot more women ready to run for office. So we're running our second round of Prepare Her and Mentor Her. And by the end of the year, we will have 60 women who will have gone through those programs who we know will be making a difference in a bunch of different ways in 2021, but we're excited to see what they'll do. So finally, as we wrap up the event series, I'm hoping that everyone here can give some thought into how they can help women make political progress in our city's politics. In addition to participating in the Parity Cup, you can always get involved with Ask Her. We're an entirely volunteer-run organization, and we'd love to have some more folks on board. If you're interested in volunteering with us, please reach out. All of our contact info is on our website, but there's a lot of work to do before the 2021 election, so we'd love to have some more folks on board. So yeah, please stay tuned, and we're looking forward to engaging with you more in the new year as we continue working towards an exciting and equally representative City Council. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this evening, and hope you have a great night. Thanks.